Hello my dear friends, you're on the Military Summary channel, and today we will discuss the situation in Ukraine on the 23rd of March of 2023. Today we have a lot of very interesting updates, so let's start. And first we're going to start with Bakhmut. Prigozhin, the head of Wagnerians, reported that the Ukrainians managed to accumulate 80,000 army around Bakhmut. As you can see, there are not much icons above this area. The Russians stopped in the vicinity of Dubovo-Vasilievka. There are no movements in the vicinity of Zelensky. The Russians haven't made any attempts in direction of Vasikovka. There are no clashes, or at least there are no reports about battles for Khromovo. The Russians are not storming Ivanovskaya. And one more time, Prigozhin told us today that Ukrainians managed to accumulate 80,000 army in the vicinity of Bakhmut. And every single day we hear more and more updates and piece of information that Ukrainians are going to start their unblocking operation tomorrow. The same situation as we saw in August of 2022, when the Ukrainians were saying and the Western sources were saying that tomorrow the Ukrainians are going to start their counter-offensive operation, and at some certain day they started. So believe me, the Ukrainians are going to start this unblock operation as well. They're just waiting for best time to do this. 80,000 soldiers. Few weeks ago, maybe a week ago, the Prigozhin, the same person, reported that there was a 50,000 army in the vicinity of Bakhmut. So that means that for less than 2 weeks, the Ukrainians managed to increase the number of forces in this area from 50,000 till 80,000 soldiers. So the Ukrainians understand that they don't have any other option. They won't have the second chance. No matter the losses, they need to unblock Bakhmut and they need to defeat Wagnerians. Let's take a look at the deployment map. And as you can see, this is like all these icons with the Ukrainian flag, and the short icon on the right, top right corner, is the number of battalions or brigade that currently are deployed in the vicinity of Bakhmut. And the number of forces is around 80,000 soldiers. And they are ready. They're over-concentrated. This area is overpopulated. And they will start. And Prigozhin understand that they're going to start. When talking about the Russian sources map, they added another icon. This is the satellite picture of Bakhmut. And these red squares is the area of fire, where if you take a look at this town from the sky, you're gonna see the fire in this area. That means that the clashes of Bakhmut, the storm process inside Bakhmut, is in the central part already. Furthermore, the Russians managed to cross this railroad, and the Russians started something like offensive operation in this square, Wagnerians, but there are no movements around town. If we take a look at the Western sources map, we understand that Ukrainians don't have a lot of options how to attack the Russians all over the front line. They have just one direction to attack, and this is this small salient between Orekhovo-Vasilievka, Zelensky, Dubovo-Vasilievka, and Sakav-Vansety. So this is the main area where the Ukrainians are going to attack, with one purpose: to unblock Bakhmut and to give opportunities and to establish or return control over the roads that goes to the northern part of Bakhmut in direction of Slaviansk. So when talking about the Russians and when talking about Wagnerians, this square, this one, these days is one of the most important square of Bakhmut, the northern part, the square that the Russians started fighting for at the beginning of this year, and just, let's say, a week ago, they managed to establish control over this territory. So the Ukrainians will try to attack this area, and they will try to push the Russians from this bank of the river on the Solidar bank of the river. So we can say that the Russians have their position somewhere along this line. So it's like the most important area. Of course, the Russians have their trenches and fortifications, Zelensky, Orekhovo-Vasilievka, and so on. And the Ukrainians are going to attack from many directions, of course. Along MO3 road, the Ukrainians will try to attack the Russians between these two lakes. The Ukrainians will try to attack the Russians from Vasikovka in direction of Sakav-Vansety. The Ukrainians will try to attack from Grigorievka and Orekhovo-Vasilievka in direction of Dubovo-Vasilievka. The Ukrainians will try to develop their offensive operation from between Bogdanovka and this railroad in direction of Berkhovskaya water reservoir. And of course, the Ukrainians will try to develop their bridgehead around the road that connects Chasov Yar and Khromovo, so they will attack in this direction as well. So we understand all these movements, and you need to know, and if you think that Ukrainians are not able to push Wagnerians back, believe me, they can. I'm not saying that Ukrainians are able to establish control over entire northern part of Bakhmut, but at least they will be able to push the Wagners back. And the thing is that if you take a look at this area, there is just fields, and it's very difficult to hide and to have some nice position to wait to survive during the Ukrainian rush. Just take a look at this map one more time and you're gonna understand. 80,000 soldiers. So they're gonna be maybe 5 or 6 endless waves of attack one after another in direction of the northern part. So of course, highly unlikely anybody who is located or have position in the vicinity of Zelensky are able to survive even a first wave of that attack. This is a very powerful army, and they're able to achieve a lot. And currently these days, the Wagners are doing just one thing. They're increasing the defense possibilities of this cloud, and they're trying to develop the bridgehead around this town. If I were Wagnerians, I would mine every single square meter in this area, because I believe that maybe this is going to be the only factor that can stop the Ukrainians completely mined fields around this cloud. When talking about the south part, of course, the Ukrainians are going to make another attempts, and the main town and the main area they need to take control over is Klishevka fortification, that located on the north of this area. If we go back to the Russian sources map, I'm talking about these trenches. So these trenches are located on the hill. So they need to control these trenches to establish, to release and to secure the road that connects Chasov Yar and Bakhmut from the south. So that's why also the Ukrainians, of course, will make few support attacks in direction of Kurdyumovka and Zaryanovka, because they have positions very close to these towns, and they will try to push Wagnerians from this area. And of course, they will try to reduce the Russian presence in this area as much as possible. When talking about town itself, about the forces that located inside the town, I'm not sure that Wagnerians are going to push. There are going to be some support attack, and I believe that maybe as soon as the Ukrainians start their offensive operation in direction of this northern part, maybe the Ukrainians will start their movement from the central part in direction of industrial zone that located on the north of Bakhmut, just to support the Ukrainian offensive operation in this area. So we'll see whether the Ukrainians are able to do anything or not, but anyway, the Russians will be forced to step back. If the Ukraine 80,000 army, this is a very big number. I don't think that Wagnerians have the same number. I believe that they have less soldiers. Of course, there are going to be some support from the Russian main army, but mainly there are going to be some artillery support. I don't think that as soon as the Russians understand that the Wagnerians have a lot of problems, maybe at this moment they will send more reserves of their regular army to stop the Ukrainians. But anyway, I believe that as a result of battle for north of Bakhmut, the Wagnerians will be forced to step back. I'm not saying that they are going to lose this bridgehead, but this is going to be something very difficult for them. It's going to be a real test for them, whether they are able to do this or not. The Ministry of Defense of Russian Federation reported that as a result of clashes on Donbas front line, the Ukrainians lost 250 soldiers, 18 armored vehicles, including 6 tanks, and 1 artillery system D-20 howitzer. So as you can see, the level of losses is very high. And the most important that during the previous 24 hours, the Ukrainians lost 6 tanks. So that means, what does it mean 6 tanks? It's the highest number of losses among tanks, I believe, that maybe since the previous autumn Ukrainian offensive operation, when they were sending waves, wave by wave, to return control over Kharkov and Kupinsk area. So 6 tanks per 24 hours. So that means that there are already over concentration of the forces, and they're trying to attack from every single area and place the Ukrainians can. So of course that's why the Russians also have possibilities to target and destroy the Ukrainian tanks. But this is not the only front line where the Ukrainians had losses, of course, and this is not the only front line we receive updates from. The second, or maybe not the second, but the first area is Avdiivka, about the importance and so on. As you can see, the Western source map has been updated, and there are few important updates that you can find on this map. The first one is that according to the Western sources map, we see that the Russians establish control or controls the territory between Novokalinovo and the railroad on the south. So that means that the Russians managed not just to enter even the vicinity of Keramik, of this small town Novokalinovo, to take control over the first streets that located on the outskirts of this town. Also, the Russians managed to cross the railroad near Novobakhmutovka. This morning started with the piece of news that the Russians finally complete the clearing operation of entire Novobakhmutovka and the vicinity of that town, and that they managed to cross the road N20 and also started their movements in direction of Keramik. If you remember, yesterday we discussed this operation. We discussed that there is a operational reserves center that located in Chertina, this on the north from this entire Avdiivka front line, and the Ukrainians uses this operational center to send the reserves in direction of Berdichi, and after that from Berdichi in direction of Stepovo, and another direction is from Achertina in direction of Keramik. And from this area the Ukrainians were supporting their forces in Novobakhmutovka, but they lost the bridgehead in this area and they were forced to step back in direction of Keramik. And I believe that we was the witnesses of, let's call it offensive operation on the shoulders of Ukrainian soldiers who were stepping back from Novobakhmutovka. Furthermore, today we got the first piece of information that the Russians they did really enter the town by the name of Stepovo, that they were entered this town, but today the Ukrainian sources are saying, and some Russian source confirms, or at least Rybar confirms, that the Russians were not defeated, that they entered this town, but then the Ukrainians sent the reserves in direction of Berdichi. The Ukrainians organized their small counter-offensive operation in this area, and the Russians were forced to step back, and now the Russians have their positions along this railroad. So it was something like when the Russians managed to penetrate these defense orders, they took a decision to continue and they entered Stepovo. It was something like a forces whose main task was to support the Russians and defend the Russians while they were preparing a defense line along this railroad. They were building trenches, they were demining this area, they prepared all kinds of types of fortifications they can, while the Russian army was in Stepovo and Berdichi and supporting them. As soon as the Ukrainians sent the reserves, I think that these forces gave them a battle, and as soon as they understand that the Russians complete the preparation of fortification along the railroad, they took a decision to step back and reorganized in direction of Krasnogorovka. Furthermore, today the Ministry of Defense of Ukraine reported about the fact that the Ukrainians managed to repulse another offensive operation in direction of Lastochkina. And as you can see, this town is located very far from, let's say, Peski front line and from Krasnogorovka front line. So that's why the Western source map took a decision to update this map this way, showing that maybe the Russians managed to penetrate some defense orders somewhere in this salient between these small towns Severnaya, Lastochkina, and a small block in the southwest of Avdiivka by the name of Ninth block. And furthermore, there was we received during the previous 24 hours or 48 hours a piece of news that the Russians were attacking this block. And furthermore, today there was a few mapping confirmation that the Russians managed to enter this small block and that they established control over the, let's say, the outskirts building along this along Avdiivka, this Avdiivka block. We haven't received any video or photo confirmation of that, but that was a piece of news that we saw today, this morning, or yesterday in the evening. So maybe there is a very high chances that maybe the Russians, after bombing of this area, because if you remember one more time, if we take a look at the Russian sources map and if we take a look at Avdiivka and we will increase the range of the period for months, we're going to see that the Russians were mainly concentrated their artillery strikes over this area. And I won't be surprised if they managed to reduce the Ukrainian forces in this block as much as possible. So maybe those attacks, those bombings gave them opportunity to penetrate the Ukrainian defense orders and to enter the outskirts of this area. It's very difficult to determine whether the Russians are able to hold this area or that was another support operation, as the Russians did on the north while attacking these two towns, Berdichi and Stepova. Maybe the Russians attacked Avdiivka with one purpose: to allow the Russians that were located between Vadiana and Opotna to penetrate the defense orders and to get as close as possible to Lastochkina. Because if the Russians are able to establish control over this town, Lastochkina, then the Russians will be able to establish control over the only road that connects Avdiivka with the mainland. It is very possible that the Russians did that, but I believe that we're going to receive this update, this piece of information, or today later, or maybe tomorrow in the morning. Very difficult to understand and determine about the progress of the Russians in this area. Furthermore, I believe that the Russians will try to develop their offensive operation in direction of Bakhmutovka. They will continue their storm of Keramik. And the thing is that, as we discussed earlier, the Ukrainians have limit in their reserves, and that's why the Russians need to freeze and pin down the Ukrainians' reserve somewhere here on the north while trying to encircle Avdiivka from the south. And also, this is the reason why the Ukrainians are going to start massive rush in direction of Bakhmut, as we discussed one more time. There are a lot of forces in this area, and as we discussed, the unblock operation of Bakhmut is going to take, I don't think that this operation is going to take for more than 7 days. At least the most important part, after 7 days, the Ukrainians will be forced to move some reserves from this area. I believe that for these 7 days, the Ukrainians will be able to get the outskirts of Berkhovka and the northern part of Bakhmut. Then they will be stopped, and then they will be forced to send their forces from Bakhmut in direction of Avdiivka. So everything is going to be very complicated. There are going to be a lot of fast and small attacks, and with the purpose to get as much as possible, to achieve as better as possible result from those attacks. Now let's go further and let's discuss other front lines. The Russians are saying that today they also started some movements in direction of Verkhnyokamyanska. The Russians activated their forces in the vicinity of Belogorovka and Verkhnyokamyanska. This is like the south area from Kremenная forest in the east of Siversk. As you can see, there are also two icons in this area, and some sources are saying that the Russians managed to enter Verkhnyokamyansk and that these days there are very heavy clashes inside of this town. This is a very powerful fortification, Ukrainian fortification. The Russians were trying to establish control over this area the last year, but all their attacks were repulsed, and after that, furthermore, the Ukrainians managed to start their own counter-offensive operation in this area, and as a result of that counter-offensive operation, the Russians lost Belogorovka and Sporne and so on, and the Russians were attacking in direction of Belogorovka. Furthermore, very interesting updates are coming from Liman front line. The Russians reported that as a result of clashes on this front line, the Ukrainians lost 80 soldiers, 5 armored vehicles, and 1 artillery system. So we see that the level of losses is not so high. But more and more sources are saying that the Russians entered or at least got the outskirts of Makeivka. This Makeivka, and the Russians have already started, let's say, the storm operation of this town. Furthermore, the Liman and Kupiansk front line, when we compare different maps, and every single map shows their own picture of that town, of this area. But anyway, we can say that, for example, according to the Russian sources map, the Russians control every single town along Zherebets River from Zherelne to Makeivka. So Makeivka is the first town along the Zherebets River that is under Russian control from Zherelne. And the Russians, according to some sources, managed to enter the outskirts and the first streets of this village. Makeivka is famous for, if you remember, while the Ukrainian counter-offensive operation, few soldiers, maybe a dozen of Russian soldiers were encircled in that town, and then they were killed by the Ukrainians, if you remember. So there was a lot of video and photo confirmation of that. Around 12 or maybe more soldiers were killed. So this is the town, and the Russians are trying to return control over this area these minutes, and after that, I believe they will start movements from Makeyevka to the south, and they will try to get control over entire area between Makeyevka and Kremenaya forest. And after that, they will start doing something with Siversk. When talking about Kupiansk front line, the level of loss of Ukrainians on this area is also very high. In comparison with the previous days, the Russians are saying that as a result of clashes in the vicinity of Dvorichna, Kupiansk, Sinkovka, Novoselovska, the Ukrainians lost 70 soldiers, 3 armored vehicles and 2 artillery systems, but without any changes on the ground. Now let's go to Zaporozhye. As you can see, there are no icons in this area at all. There were just regular artillery duels on Zaporozhye and Ugledar front line. Mainly the Ukrainians, there were heavy clashes in the vicinity of Ugledar. The Russians bombed Ugledar, and that information was included into the report of Ministry of Defense. And as a result of clashes all over the front line, the Ukrainians lost 50 soldiers, 4 armored vehicles and 2 artillery systems, D-20 and D-30 howitzer. And when talking about Kherson, this morning, the Ukrainian special forces started spreading the piece information that the Russians took a decision to step back from Novokakhovka. So it's some kind of a big preparation before something big, something greatest in this area. But later, the governor or the mayor of this area from the Russian side reported that nobody left and that the Russians are on their position and they are waiting for the Ukrainians if they want to cross the river. So they're welcome. As a result of clashes during the previous 24 hours on Kherson front line, the Ukrainians lost 15 soldiers and 5 armored vehicles. So we expect for the greatest battle in Bakhmut and Avdiivka, and this is going to be very interesting, and these 2 battles are going to determine the future of this special operation, at least for the next half a year. So we'll see. And that's it for today. Military Summary channel reminds to condemn any violence in Ukraine. Thank you for watching. Subscribe to my channel, put your likes, join my Patreon, and have a good day. Bye bye.